Dubai, 2023. The sun had barely risen over the desert metropolis when the construction crew arrived at a development site in the Al Barsha district. What happened next would bring work to a complete halt, leaving a multi-million-dollar project in limbo and a team of seasoned workers refusing to return, no matter the consequences to their employment. The foreman, a man who had worked construction across 3 continents for over 2 decades, described equipment malfunctioning without explanation, tools disappearing and reappearing in impossible locations, and a sensation he struggled to articulate, a feeling of being observed by something that existed just beyond the threshold of human perception. But it was the sound that finally broke the crew's resolve. A voice, clear as day, speaking in a language none of them recognized, seeming to emanate from the excavated earth itself. When the temperature in the pit dropped 30 degrees in a matter of seconds, despite the scorching desert heat above, the workers climbed out and never descended again. The official reports cited equipment failure and structural concerns. The workers knew differently. They had disturbed something ancient, something that had been there long before the glass towers and highways, something that wanted to remain hidden. This brings us to a question that most dismiss without consideration. What if the beings described in texts spanning thousands of years, across countless cultures and civilizations, are not mythology? What if they are not metaphors, or the confused observations of prescientific minds? What if they are documentation of a hidden species that has shared this world with us since before recorded history, watching from spaces between what we can see and what we refuse to believe? In Islamic tradition and the folklore that predates it by millennia, these beings have a name: Jinn. Created, according to these sources, from smokeless fire thousands of years before the first human drew breath. Not spirits. Not demons in the Western sense, but a parallel form of intelligent life, existing in frequencies of reality our senses cannot detect unless they choose, for reasons of their own, to be revealed. 7 types. 7 distinct classifications, each with different abilities, different temperaments, different levels of danger to human beings who cross their paths. Some are merely mischievous, others are predatory, and the most powerful among them possess capabilities that would redefine our understanding of what is possible in this universe. They see us, every moment, every movement. We are utterly visible to them, but we cannot see them, cannot detect them, cannot prove their existence with any instrument we have devised, unless they decide otherwise. And that asymmetry of perception should terrify you, because it means we have been observed, studied, and perhaps cataloged by an intelligence we cannot monitor or predict. The implications stretch far beyond campfire stories. If such beings exist, then we are not alone, and we have never been alone. Every moment of human history has unfolded under the gaze of witnesses we never acknowledged. Every decision, every war, every civilization has risen and fallen with unseen observers present. And if the accounts are accurate, they have occasionally intervened, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering, but always for motivations entirely their own. What follows is an investigation into the 7 types, drawn from sources both ancient and disturbingly recent. We will examine the evidence, the patterns, and the encounters that suggest something beyond our current understanding shares this planet with us. We will explore what they want, how they interact with our world, and most importantly, how to recognize when you have drawn their attention. Because according to those who study these phenomena, such attention, once gained, is almost impossible to lose. The workers in Dubai never returned to that site. The project was quietly abandoned, and if you visit the location today, you will find the excavation filled in, paved over, erased from the landscape as if it never existed. But the workers remember, and they will tell you, with absolute conviction in their voices, that some ground should never be broken, and some presences should never be disturbed. They learned this lesson the hard way. The question that remains is whether you will believe them before you learn it yourself. In the ancient cosmology of Arabian mysticism, there exists a hierarchy among the Jinn that mirrors the stratification of power in human kingdoms. At the apex of this supernatural order dwells the Murid, entities so formidable and primordial that even King Solomon himself, who commanded legions of lesser Jinn, found them nearly impossible to buy. These are not the trickster spirits of desert crossroads, or the malevolent whispers in abandoned home. The Marid are something far more terrible, far more ancient, and infinitely more dangerous. The name itself carries weight in the linguistic traditions of the Arabian Peninsula. Marid, derived from the root meaning rebellious or defiant, speaks to their fundamental nature. They are creatures of absolute arrogance, beings who predate the current order of creation, and remember times when the world was nothing but elemental chaos. While lesser Jinn might be bound by ritual and incantation, while they might be trapped in vessels or compelled by sacred names, the Marid resist all attempts at subjugation with a fury that has cost many ambitious sorcerers their lives and their souls. Classical Arabian texts describe the Marid with a mixture of reverence and terror. The 9th century scholar Al-Jahiz wrote of them as the eldest children of smokeless fire, created before the earth had cooled, when water and flame still danced together in the formless void. Unlike their cousins who inhabit ruins and graveyards, the Marid choose their domains with deliberate care. They are drawn to water sources in remote and isolated places, springs that bubble up from unknown depths, pools that never freeze or evaporate, wells that predate human settlement. These are the thrones from which they observe the mortal world, granting favors when it amuses them, and exacting terrible prices when their pride is wounded. In the mountains of northeastern Yemen, nestled in a valley so remote that even today it remains accessible only by foot or animal, there exists a village whose name I will not speak here. The residents have requested anonymity, not from shame, but from a fear that runs deeper than any concern for reputation. This village of perhaps 200 souls has been sustained for centuries by a single freshwater spring that flows from a crack in the black volcanic rock that dominates the landscape. In this arid region where water is more precious than gold, where neighboring settlements have been abandoned when their wells ran dry, this village has thrived. But the water, the villagers will tell you in voices barely above whispers, was never truly theirs. It belonged to something else, something that permitted them to drink and grow their crops and fill their cisterns, but only under conditions that were established long before living memory. The pact, according to village tradition, was struck in the time of the grandfathers of the grandfathers, perhaps 400 or 500 years ago. The exact date has been lost, transformed into the timeless past of all oral histories. The first settlers to arrive in this valley found the spring already flowing, pure and cold and inexhaustible. But when they came to drink, the spring ran red with what appeared to be blood. Terrified, they fled to higher ground. That night, the eldest among them claimed to have received a visitation in his dreams. A figure appeared, neither holy man nor entirely something else, beautiful beyond description, yet terrible in its perfection. The being spoke in classical Arabic so pure that the dreamer, an illiterate shepherd, could scarcely understand the words. But the message was clear enough. The water could sustain the village, but only if they honored the true master of the spring. The requirements were specific. Once each year on the night of the new moon in the month of Shaban, the village must bring offerings to the spring. These were not symbolic gestures, not mere flowers or incense. The Marid demanded flesh, blood, and beauty. A lamb, white and unblemished, slaughtered at the water's edge. Silver jewelry worked by hand cast into the depths. And a poem, composed specifically for the occasion, praising the majesty and power of the spring's guardian. These offerings were to be delivered by a young woman of the village, beautiful and pure, who would approach the spring alone at midnight, perform the rituals, and return before dawn. No one was to watch or follow. This was the covenant, and for centuries it was honored. Those who claim to have seen the Marid describe an entity that defies consistent physical description. This shape-shifting ability is central to their nature. One account from the 1950s, documented by a French anthropologist studying the region, includes testimony from an elderly woman who had served as the offering bearer in her youth. She described approaching the spring on the appointed night and seeing the water itself rise up, taking on a vaguely human form that towered perhaps 15 or 20 feet above the pool. The figure was composed entirely of water, yet it held its shape with perfect stability, droplets spiraling within its translucent body like galaxies within glass. Its face, when it deigned to show one, was beautiful beyond mortal perfection, with features that seemed to shift between male and female, young and ancient, kind and utterly merciless. But beauty was only one mask the Marid chose to wear. Others reported encountering a form that inspired pure visceral terror, eyes that burned with cold blue fire, a mouth filled with crystalline teeth sharp as obsidian shards, limbs that ended not in hands but in writhing tendrils of water that could caress or drown with equal ease. The Marid's mood, witnesses claim, determined its appearance. When pleased with the offerings, when the poetry was particularly eloquent or the silver especially fine, it would appear as a being of ethereal grace. When insulted or disappointed, it would manifest nightmare made liquid. The arrogance of the Marid is legendary throughout Arabian demonology. Unlike lesser jinn who might serve powerful magicians or be compelled by religious authority, the Marid considers itself answerable to no one. Medieval grimoires contain warnings about attempting to summon these entities. The rituals exist, recorded in fading ink on ancient parchment. But the texts emphasize that, even if successful, the summoning is more likely to result in the magician's death than any useful service. The Marid does not negotiate from a position of need. It has existed for millennia, and will exist for millennia more. Human lifespans are mayflies to them, entire civilizations mere moments in their awareness. This attitude permeates every recorded interaction with these beings. They grant favors not out of obligation, but as a demonstration of their superiority. They maintain pacts not because they must, but because order pleases them more than chaos, at least for a time. To break faith with a Marid is not merely to anger a powerful entity, it is to offer personal insult to a being whose pride is absolute and whose memory is eternal. In the Yemeni village, the pact endured through Ottoman occupation, through the various civil conflicts that have racked the region, through the arrival of modern government, and attempted modernization. But in the early 1970s, something changed. A young man named Khalil, whose family had lived in the village for generations, returned from university in Sana'a. He had studied engineering and political science. He had encountered socialist ideology and scientific rationalism. He had learned to see the world through secular eyes, and when he looked at his village's most sacred tradition, he saw nothing but superstition. Khalil's grandson still lives, though he has left the village and resides now in a coastal city where he works as a mechanic. He agreed to speak with researchers on the condition of anonymity. His testimony, recorded in 2008, provides the only first-hand account of what happened when the pact was broken. He was only 7 years old at the time, but the memories remain vivid, carved into his consciousness with the sharp edge of childhood trauma. According to the grandson, Khalil began openly mocking the spring ritual. He called it primitive nonsense, a waste of valuable resources. The silver jewelry, he argued, could be sold to buy medicine or tools. The lamb could be eaten by families who needed the protein. When the time came for the annual offering in 1973, Khalil organized a group of young men, all recent returnees from education abroad, to prevent the ceremony. They stood guard at the spring, turning away the designated offering bearer. They cast no jewelry into the water. They slaughtered no lamb. Instead, they declared the spring a communal resource, free from supernatural taxation. For 3 days, nothing happened. Khalil proclaimed victory over superstition. But on the 4th morning, the spring ran dry. Not slowly, not gradually as might happen from natural geological changes, but instantly. Villagers who went to draw water at dawn found only damp rocks where the flow had been. Within a week, the pool that had sustained the village for centuries was nothing but a dusty depression in the volcanic stone. Khalil attributed this to coincidence, to underground shifts unrelated to the mist ritual. He organized efforts to dig new wells, to find alternative water sources. But what happened next could not be so easily dismissed. The drownings began exactly 1 lunar month after the broken pact. The first victim was a young boy, Khalil's own nephew, who fell into an irrigation ditch containing barely 6 inches of water. He was found face down, drowned in a depth that should have been impossible to die in. 3 days later, an elderly woman drowned in her own home, her face submerged in a washing basin. Then a farmer, found dead in a rain puddle after a light shower, water filling his lungs, though witnesses had seen him alive and walking just minutes before. In the space of 6 weeks, 11 people drowned in the village and its immediate surroundings. Each death occurred in water that should have been insufficient to drown a conscious person. Each victim showed signs of struggle, of having fought against something, but there were never any witnesses to what actually occurred. The village elders convened in desperation. They begged Khalil to allow them to resume the offerings, to seek forgiveness from whatever dwelt in the now dry spring. But Khalil refused, his pride perhaps matching that of the Marid itself. He insisted that diseases or accidents were the cause, that renewed ritual would only reinforce dangerous superstitions. The drowning stopped only after Khalil himself died. The circumstances remain disputed. The official record states that he drowned while bathing in the sea during a trip to Aden, miles from the village. But his grandson tells a different story, one he claims to have heard from his grandmother on her deathbed. She said that Khalil, tormented by guilt and fear, finally traveled alone to the dry spring one night to offer apologies and tribute. He was found the next morning at the bottom of the empty pool, his lungs full of water, though not a drop remained in the stone basin. His face, witnesses said, showed absolute terror, and his body bore marks like the impressions of enormous hands made of water, indentations in his flesh that slowly filled with fluid. After Khalil's death, the village elders attempted to restore the ritual offerings. They brought the finest lamb they could find. They pooled their resources to create silver ornaments, and they composed poems of apology and supplication. A young woman chosen for her devotion and courage carried these offerings to the spring at midnight. But the spring did not flow again. Whether the Marid was too insulted to forgive, or whether it had simply moved on to some other remote water source, the village never regained what it had lost. Within 10 years, most families had relocated to regions with more reliable water access. The few who remain survive on trucked-in water and a small modern well that produces only brackish, barely drinkable fluid. The story of this Yemeni village is not unique. Throughout the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, wherever the Marid are said to dwell, similar tales emerge. Springs that sustained settlements for centuries, suddenly failing. Communities that honored water spirits thriving against all environmental odds. And always the warning that the Marid are not to be trifled with, that their power is matched only by their pride, and that bargains made with them must be honored absolutely. In the great libraries of the Islamic world, in manuscripts dating back over 1,000 years, scholars recorded encounters with these entities and offered advice for those who might encounter them. The consensus is clear and consistent. Avoid them if at all possible, honor them absolutely if you cannot avoid them, and never, under any circumstances, assume you can control or deceive them. The first sign that something had gone wrong in the Balochistan copper mine came not with a sound, but with silence. On the morning of July 16, 2019, a drilling crew working 300 meters beneath the arid hills of western Pakistan broke through into a space that should not have existed. The pneumatic drill bit, which had been chewing through limestone for hours, suddenly lurched forward into emptiness. The crew supervisor, a man named Rashid Mahmoud, who had worked mines for 23 years, immediately ordered the drill withdrawn. What they found behind that wall changed everything that followed. The opening they had created was roughly circular, about the width of a man's shoulders. When they shone their work lamps into the darkness beyond, the lights seemed to be swallowed rather than reflected. The air that came from the chamber carried a strange quality, warm and oddly stale, as though it had been trapped for centuries. One of the younger workers later described the smell as resembling burnt cinnamon mixed with sulfur, an unsettling combination that made several men step back from the opening. But it was the temperature differential that struck Rashid most forcefully. The mine maintained a relatively constant cool temperature at that depth, rarely exceeding 15 degrees Celsius. The air flowing from this chamber felt like the breath from an oven. Against the advice of Rashid, 3 workers volunteered to investigate the chamber. Their names were Qareen, Fahad, and Jamil, young men in their 20s who saw adventure where their supervisor saw danger. They were contracted laborers, paid by the day, and they joked that perhaps they had discovered a treasure vault, some ancient king's buried fortune that would make them all rich. The mining company had insurance for such discoveries. There would be bonuses, time off, perhaps even media attention. So they enlarged the opening with hand tools, carefully widening it until a man could crawl through, and one by one, they entered the sealed chamber. What they found inside defied the geological surveys that had mapped this area. The chamber was not a natural cave formation. It was clearly constructed, roughly circular, perhaps 8 meters in diameter. The walls bore marks of toolwork, deliberate carving into the bedrock. But most striking were the symbols. Covering nearly every surface were inscriptions in Arabic script, Old Arabic, the kind seen in medieval manuscripts. None of the 3 men could read classical Arabic well enough to decipher the text, but they recognized certain words. Allah. Jinn. Fire, fire. And one word that appeared again and again, circling the chamber at eye level like a warning, repeated endlessly. Sealed, 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 sealed. In the center of the chamber stood a stone cairn, a deliberate pile of rocks forming a cone roughly waist high. The stones were not from the local geology. They were darker, possibly basalt, each one carefully shaped to fit against its neighbors. The 3 workers photographed everything with their mobile phones. They touched the walls, running their fingers over the inscriptions. Fahad, the boldest of the 3, placed his hand on the central cairn. He later told the imam that the stones felt warm to the touch, fever warm, despite the chamber having been sealed off from any heat source for what must have been centuries. They remained inside for perhaps 15 minutes before crawling back out to report their findings. The mining company supervisor was contacted. Within hours, a directive came down from the main office. Document the chamber, photograph everything, but do not disturb it further. An archaeological team would need to be consulted. The Islamic inscriptions suggested this might be a historical site, possibly medieval, which meant government permits and academic reviews. The mining operation in that shaft was suspended pending investigation. That first night, nothing seemed amiss. The crew finished their shift and returned to the workers' compound, a collection of prefabricated buildings about 2 kilometers from the mine entrance. Qareen, Fahad, and Jamil were local celebrities for the evening, showing their photographs, describing the mysterious chamber. Some of the older workers looked at the images and became quiet. One man, a Pashtun who had worked mines across Pakistan and Afghanistan, stared at the repeating word, sealed, and shook his head slowly. He advised the 3 to visit the mosque, to make prayers, to perform ablutions. They laughed at his superstition. The second day brought the first disappearances. Tools began vanishing from the work site. Not the large equipment, but personal items. Hammers, chisels, water bottles, the small things that workers kept in their belts or bags. A wrench would be set down on a rock, and when a man turned back, it would be gone. At first, this seemed like ordinary theft or carelessness, but the pattern was too consistent. By midday, 14 separate items had vanished. Security footage from the mine entrance showed no one removing anything. The items simply ceased to be where they had been placed. Then came the heat. Tunnel 7, the shaft where the chamber had been discovered, began to experience temperature spikes. The mine used continuous monitoring for safety, sensors tracking air quality and temperature throughout the operation. At 11:23 in the morning of the second day, the sensors in Tunnel 7 registered a temperature increase from 14 degrees Celsius to 38 degrees Celsius in less than 6 minutes. Workers evacuated immediately, fearing a fire or equipment malfunction. But when engineers investigated, they found no source for the heat. No electrical faults, no combustion, no geological explanation. The air itself had simply become scorching hot. Within an hour, the temperature returned to normal. This pattern repeated throughout the day. Sudden, intense heat in Tunnel 7, sometimes spreading to adjacent passages. Workers reported that the heat seemed to move, to travel through the tunnels as though searching. One crew, working in Tunnel 9, which connected to Tunnel 7 through a side passage, described feeling a wave of heat pass through their location, like a physical presence moving past them. The temperature spike lasted perhaps 90 seconds, intense enough that men were loosening their clothes and gasping, and then it was gone, continuing deeper into the mine. On the third day, the 3 workers who had entered the chamber reported feeling unwell. Qareen complained of fever, and showed his foreman a rash developing on his forearms, red and inflamed. Fahad had similar marks on his hands, the same hands he had used to touch the central cairn. Jamil, who had spent the least time in the chamber and touched nothing except the walls near the entrance, showed only minor irritation on his palms. They were sent to the medical officer at the compound, a trained paramedic who maintained a clinic for the workers. What the medic found disturbed him enough to photograph the injuries and send the images to a hospital in Quetta. The rashes were not typical of any contact dermatitis he recognized. They appeared as patterns, almost like branching frost patterns, but raised and inflamed. Kareem's arms showed the worst development, the redness spreading from his forearms toward his shoulders, in lines that the medic described as resembling Arabic script, though he admitted this might be his imagination finding patterns where none existed. More concerning were the burns. By the evening of the third day, all three men had developed what appeared to be second-degree burns on the areas that had shown the rashes. But they reported no exposure to heat, no accident, no source for such injuries. The burns worsened overnight. By morning of the fourth day, Kareem was running a fever of 40 degrees Celsius, and the burns on his arms had begun to weep and blister in ways that suggested infection, though cultured samples would later show no bacterial presence. Fahad could barely use his hands, the burns so severe across his palms and fingers that the skin had begun to blacken in places. The company arranged for all three men to be transported to the regional hospital, but before the ambulance arrived, the workers' families intervened. This was when Imam Hassan al-Wood was summoned to the site, a religious scholar in his 60s, educated in Lahore and respected throughout the province. The Imam was known for his knowledge of traditional Islamic teachings regarding the Jinn. The families of the afflicted workers begged him to come to the mine, to see the chamber, to determine whether they were dealing with something beyond medical explanation. The mining company, desperate to resolve the situation and resume operations, agreed to allow him access. Imam Hassan entered the chamber on the fifth day after its discovery. He went alone, carrying only a Qareen and a small oil lamp in the traditional style. He later described his experience in an interview that was recorded by a journalist from Dawn newspaper. The Imam explained that the moment he passed through the opening into the chamber, he felt what he called a presence, an awareness that was distinctly hostile. The air was not simply warm, but carried what he described as an anger, a rage that had been building for centuries. He read the inscriptions on the walls, and his face, according to witnesses who watched from the tunnel, became grave. The inscriptions were binding verses, he explained later. Quranic passages specifically associated with the containment of Jinn, repeated in patterns that served as both prayer and prison. The chamber had been created as a prison, a deliberate construction meant to seal something dangerous away from the world of men. The central cairn, he believed, marked the actual binding point, the place where whatever entity had been trapped was anchored to the physical world. By disturbing the chamber, by touching the cairn, the workers had weakened the bindings, and the entity sealed within was an Ifrit. The Ifrit are described in Islamic tradition as a powerful category of Jinn, beings created from smokeless fire, proud and cunning, and particularly vengeful when wrong. Unlike the lesser Jinn or the sometimes benevolent Jinn of folklore, the Ifrit are consistently portrayed as dangerous, rebellious against divine order, and utterly merciless when their domains are violated. King Solomon, according to tradition, had the power to bind such beings, commanding them to labor or imprisoning them for their crimes against humanity. The inscriptions in the chamber suggested this was such a binding, created by someone with deep knowledge of the necessary prayers and preparations. Imam Hassan performed the traditional rites of cleansing and protection. He recited specific surahs from the Quran, particularly the verse of the throne and the last two surahs, which are traditionally used as protection against unseen evil. He burned specific incenses, combinations of frankincense and myrrh, that are mentioned in Hadith literature as displeasing to malevolent Jinn. He sprinkled water that had been blessed with Quranic recitation, and he addressed the Ifrit directly, acknowledging its presence, apologizing for the disturbance, and commanding it in the name of God to cease its attacks on the workers. The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature in the chamber spiked so rapidly that the Imam's clothing began to smoke. The oil lamp he carried exploded, the glass shattering, though the Imam was not cut. From the tunnel outside, Workers heard a sound they described as a roar, but not from any animal they recognized, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their chests rather than their ears. The imam stumbled from the chamber, his face pale, his hands shaking. He told the mine supervisor that the Ifrit was beyond his ability to banish or bind. It had been imprisoned for so long that its rage had grown to monstrous proportions, and the workers who had broken the seal had become the focus of its vengeance. The imam's recommendation was clear: reseal the chamber immediately, using both physical barriers and spiritual protections. He wrote out specific verses to be inscribed on a metal plate that would be mounted over the sealed entrance. He instructed that no one should enter the chamber again, that the mining operation should avoid that entire section of tunnels, that the 3 afflicted workers should be taken to receive both medical treatment and spiritual healing from someone with greater knowledge than his own. He suggested a specific scholar in Multan who had studied the traditional methods of dealing with Jinn possession and attack. The mining company, facing mounting pressure from workers who were now refusing to enter certain sections of the mine, agreed to the imam's suggestions. The chamber was sealed with concrete reinforced with steel mesh. The metal plate bearing Quranic verses was mounted over the seal. The entire section of Tunnel 7 was closed off and marked as structurally unsafe, though the geological surveys showed no such problems. The 3 workers were transported to Multan, where they spent 2 weeks under the care of the religious scholar the imam had recommended. The treatments they received were traditional, centuries old. Quranic verses were recited over them continuously. They were bathed in water infused with holy words. They were required to perform specific prayers at specific times. The scholar, whose name was kept private at the family's request, reportedly performed a ritual of severance, a ceremony designed to cut the spiritual connection between the Ifrit and its victims. The burns on the 3 men slowly healed, though all 3 bear scars in those strange branching patterns that the medic had documented. Qareen, who had the most contact with the chamber, lost some mobility in his left arm where the scarring was most severe. The mine resumed limited operations 6 weeks after the chamber was discovered, but Tunnel 7 and all connected passages remained sealed. Workers reported no further incidents of extreme heat or disappearing tools. The mining company classified the chamber as an archaeological site in their reports and notified the appropriate government agencies, though as of 2 years later, no official archaeological investigation had been conducted. The site remained sealed, the Quranic verses still mounted over the concrete barrier, the warnings in Arabic still circling the walls within: sealed, 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 sealed. The case of the Balochistan Ifrit, as it became known in some circles, fits a pattern found throughout Islamic history and folklore. The Ifrit are not merely malevolent spirits, but beings of intelligence and memory, capable of grudges that span centuries. They are said to prefer dwelling in isolated places, underground spaces, ruins, and abandoned structures. They despise being disturbed with an intensity that seems disproportionate to human sensibilities, but perhaps makes sense for a being that experiences time differently than mortals do. A century of imprisonment to an Ifrit might feel like yesterday's insult. Historical accounts describe similar encounters. Medieval chronicles from the Islamic world contain numerous reports of construction projects disturbing ancient Jinn dwellings and suffering consequences. Builders would fall ill with mysterious fevers. Tools would break or vanish. Fires would erupt from no source. The solutions were always the same: acknowledgement, respect, and if possible, avoidance. The wise builder would change his plans, construct around the dwelling rather than through it, and leave offerings or prayers to appease the disturbed spirits. The question that haunts this case is whether we are dealing with actual supernatural entities or with very human psychology and unexplained natural phenomena. The burns on the 3 workers were documented and photographed, real physical injuries that required real medical treatment. The temperature spikes were recorded by electronic sensors, not merely felt by frightened workers. Yet no conventional explanation has been offered for these events. No geological heat source was found. No electrical or mechanical fault was discovered. The burns appeared without any reported exposure to heat or chemicals. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the intersection of belief and experience. The workers believed they had disturbed something that should not be disturbed. That belief created fear, and fear creates stress, and stress can manifest in physical ways that medical science is only beginning to understand. Or perhaps, as Imam Hassan believed, there are more things in the deep places of the earth than our modern worldview allows for. Perhaps the old warnings carved into chamber walls are not superstition but hard-won wisdom, the knowledge that some seals should never be broken, some doors should never be opened, and some ancient grudges are best left sleeping in the dark. The chamber remains sealed. The scars remain on 3 men's arms. And somewhere in the tunnels of a copper mine in western Pakistan, behind concrete and steel and prayers carved in metal, something waits that has been waiting for a very long time. The desert wind carries many secrets, but none more terrible than the stories whispered around Bedouin campfires about the creatures that wait beyond the firelight's protective glow. In the vast emptiness of Arabia, where sand meets sky in an endless horizon, travelers learned early that not everything human-shaped was truly human. The Ghul emerged from the oldest darkness of pre-Islamic Arabia, a name that would echo through centuries and continents, transforming into the word we now know as Ghul. But the modern understanding of this creature barely scratches the surface of what desert peoples feared for thousands of years. The Ghul was not simply a corpse-eater or mindless monster. It was something far more insidious, a shapeshifter of terrible intelligence that understood human psychology with predatory precision. Long before the Prophet Muhammad walked the Arabian Peninsula, Bedouin tribes told stories of the Ghul that would remain remarkably consistent across generations. These were not simple campfire tales meant to frighten children, but survival knowledge passed down with deadly seriousness. The desert was dangerous enough without adding supernatural threats, yet the Ghul stories persisted because too many travelers returned with experiences that defied rational explanation. The classic encounter followed a pattern so specific and so frequently reported that dismissing it as mere folklore becomes difficult. A lone traveler, or sometimes a small group, would be crossing the desert as dusk approached. The quality of desert light at that hour creates strange optical effects, making distances impossible to judge, causing rocks to shimmer and shift in the heat haze. Visibility becomes unreliable precisely when the Ghul prefers to hunt. In the fading light, the traveler would see a figure in the distance. Sometimes it appeared as a beautiful woman, dressed in flowing garments that seemed too fine for the harsh environment. Other times it took the form of a fellow traveler, someone who might reasonably be crossing the same desolate path. The figure would call out, and here the accounts become particularly chilling. The voice would be familiar. Not just similar, but perfect. A wife's voice calling her husband's name. A mother seeking her son. A brother hailing his sibling. The mimicry was so exact that experienced desert travelers developed strict protocols. If you heard a loved one's voice in the desert, particularly at dusk, you did not respond. You did not investigate. You recited protective verses and continued on your path, no matter how desperately the voice called or how convincing it sounded. Because those who followed that familiar voice into the gathering darkness rarely returned, and when they did, they were found days later, wandering and delirious, speaking of horrors that had worn the faces of people they loved. One of the earliest documented accounts comes from pre-Islamic poetry, where the poet Tarifa ibn al-Ab described the desolate places where ghouls were said to dwell. He spoke of creatures that could assume any form, that fed on travelers foolish enough to leave the protection of their companions. The desert, in his words, belonged to them once the sun began its descent. By the time Islamic scholars began recording and analyzing these traditions, the Ghul had already been woven into the cultural consciousness of Arabia for centuries. The Quran itself mentions Jinn, acknowledging the existence of beings beyond human perception, and Islamic scholars debated the nature of the Ghul. Was it a type of Jinn? A demon? Or something else entirely? Some scholars classified the Ghul as a particularly malevolent category of Jinn, beings created from smokeless fire who could interact with the physical world in ways that defied natural law. The association between ghouls and graveyards added another layer to the mythology. In societies where proper burial and respect for the dead held immense cultural significance, the idea of a creature that haunted burial grounds and desecrated graves struck at the heart of social order. Travelers reported seeing lights flickering among tombs at night, hearing voices of the recently deceased calling from burial sites. Those who investigated found nothing, or worse, found something that looked human until you saw its eyes reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. What makes the ghoul particularly terrifying in the historical accounts is its intelligence. This was not a mindless beast operating on instinct. The ghoul studied its prey, learned their vulnerabilities, exploited their psychology. It understood that humans responded to familiar voices, that a beautiful woman appearing to offer aid would disarm a man's natural caution, that grief made people vulnerable to believing their dead loved ones might somehow call out one more time. Medieval Arab travelers and merchants carried these stories along the trade routes, and remarkably similar accounts began appearing in North Africa, Persia, and eventually as far as Morocco and the western edges of the Sahara. The names varied by region, the specific details shifted with local culture, but the core pattern remained: a shape-shifting entity that appeared at dusk in desolate places, that could mimic human form and voice with perfect accuracy, that lured victims away from safety before revealing its true nature. In the year 768, the scholar Al-Jahiz recorded testimony from caravan guards who described an encounter near a remote oasis. They had made camp as darkness fell when they heard one of their companions calling for help from beyond the firelight. His voice was panicked, claiming he had been bitten by a snake and needed assistance. But the man whose voice they heard was sitting right there among them, staring into the darkness with growing horror as something out there called for help using his own voice. The guards built up the fire and did not sleep that night. At dawn, they found tracks circling their camp, prints that started human but gradually shifted into something else. Something with too many joints in the foot, with claws instead of toes. The consistency of these accounts across centuries and vast geographical distances suggests something more than storytelling embellishment. Folklorists and anthropologists who have studied ghoul encounters note that the reports follow similar patterns whether they come from 9th century Baghdad, 14th century Cairo, or 20th century Morocco. The timing remains constant, that liminal hour between day and night when human perception is least reliable. The locations stay the same: empty places far from human habitation, graveyards and ruins where the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond seems thinner. Modern accounts from rural Morocco, collected by researchers in the 1970s and 1980s, describe experiences that mirror those recorded over 1,000 years earlier. A shepherd hearing his mother's voice calling him from an old cemetery at dusk. A woman traveling between villages who encountered what appeared to be her deceased husband standing beside the road. In each case, something in the encounter felt wrong, some subtle wrongness that triggered ancient survival instincts. Those who trusted that feeling and fled survived to tell their stories. The ghoul's alleged feeding habits varied by account. Some traditions claimed it consumed human flesh, particularly favoring corpses, which explained its association with graveyards. Other accounts suggested something more sinister, that the ghoul fed on the life force itself, draining victims until they became hollow shells, alive but fundamentally empty. Survivors of ghoul encounters, rare as they were, often described a profound exhaustion that lingered for months, a sense that something vital had been taken from them. The psychological dimension of the ghoul legend reveals deep truths about human vulnerability. We are social creatures who depend on recognizing and trusting one another. Our survival throughout history has relied on responding to familiar voices, on helping those who call out in distress, on forming bonds of trust and reciprocity. The ghoul weaponizes these very instincts against us. It is predatory mimicry taken to its most sophisticated extreme, exploiting not our physical weaknesses, but our emotional and psychological architecture. Even today, in an age of electric lights and GPS navigation, stories continue to emerge from the desert regions where the ghoul was first feared. Truck drivers crossing the Sahara tell of figures appearing in their headlights at night, thumbs out for a ride. Faces that look almost right but not quite. Oil workers in remote Arabian facilities report hearing colleagues calling for help from outside the compound perimeter. Voices that sound convincing until they remember that particular colleague is on leave, thousands of miles away. The ghoul endures because it represents something that transcends cultural boundaries and historical periods. It embodies the fear of deception, Of familiar things turned predatory, of the wilderness that exists beyond human control. In the stories passed down through generations, in the warnings given to travelers even now, the Ghul reminds us that the world contains mysteries that predate our understanding, presences that knew the desert before humans claimed it, and shadows that wait patiently for dusk to fall and the unwary to wander just a little too far from the light. The journal entry from the 14th of March 2019 reads simply, "It came to my bed again last night. I could feel its weight on my chest, its breath on my neck. My husband slept beside me and heard nothing." Lila Mansour did not consider herself superstitious. A 32-year-old accountant living in a modern apartment building in Alexandria, Egypt. She had spent her adult life building a career grounded in numbers, logic, and verifiable facts. But over 18 months, something systematically dismantled the rational world she had constructed around herself. What began as vivid dreams evolved into waking encounters that left physical evidence on her body, records that doctors could measure but not explain, and recordings that captured sounds no one should be able to hear. Her case would eventually be examined by 5 different Islamic scholars, 2 psychiatrists, 3 medical doctors, and a researcher from Cairo University. None could offer a conventional explanation. The scholars, however, shared a grim consensus. Lila had become the obsession of a Sila, one of the most intimate and disturbing forms of Jinn attachment known to Islamic demonology. The Sila occupies a unique and unsettling place in the taxonomy of invisible beings. Unlike other Jinn that haunt locations or terrorize communities, the Sila fixates on individuals. Female in nature, these entities are said to develop what can only be described as romantic or sexual obsessions with human men, though cases involving women, like Layla, also exist. The attachment is deeply personal, possessive, and often violent when the object of obsession shows affection to others or attempts to break free. Layla's first entry mentioning unusual experiences dates back to September of 2017. She described a recurring dream of a woman standing at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep. The figure appeared beautiful but wrong, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's and skin that seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence. In the dreams, the woman never spoke, only stared with an expression Layla described as hungry longing mixed with rage. For 3 months, the dreams came nightly. Then they began bleeding into waking life. On a Tuesday morning in early December, Layla woke to find 3 long scratches running down her left shoulder blade. They were deep enough to have drawn blood, staining her nightgown. Her husband, Ahmed, examined the marks with growing concern. The pattern was too regular to be accidental, the angle wrong for self-infliction during sleep. Their bedroom door had been locked from the inside. No one else had access to their apartment. Over the following weeks, the marks multiplied. Scratches appeared on her thighs, her abdomen, her back. Twice, she woke with what appeared to be bite marks on her neck and collarbone. Ahmed began sleeping in lighter cycles, determined to catch whatever was happening. On the night of January 6, 2018, he finally witnessed something that defied his understanding of reality. He woke to find Layla thrashing in bed, her body arched backward in a position that seemed anatomically impossible. Her eyes were open, but unseeing, and from her throat came a low, guttural sound that he swore was not her voice. As he reached for her, he felt resistance, as though pushing against an invisible barrier surrounding her body. The sensation lasted perhaps 15 seconds before Layla suddenly went limp, gasping for air. When he examined her in the lamplight, fresh scratches were appearing on her arms as they watched, thin lines of blood rising to the surface of her skin, with no visible cause. They consulted a doctor the next morning. The physician documented the injuries, noting their unusual pattern and depth. He could offer no medical explanation but suggested psychological evaluation. The psychiatrist found Layla mentally sound, showing no signs of psychosis, dissociative disorders, or self-harm behavior. Her psychological profile was, in the doctor's words, frustratingly normal. It was Ahmed's mother who first spoke the word, Sila. She had heard stories from her own grandmother about women who became prey to these entities. The signs matched perfectly. The obsessive attention, the physical marks, the sensation of presence, the targeting of a married woman, as though the entity was jealous of her human relationship. She urged them to consult a religious scholar. Sheikh Hassan al-Maliki had been practicing Ruqya, Islamic spiritual healing, for over 30 years. When Layla and Ahmed came to him in February of 2018, he listened to their account with a grave expression that suggested he had heard similar stories before. He asked Layla to keep a detailed journal of every experience, no matter how minor. He also gave her a digital voice recorder and instructed her to keep it running at night. The recordings Layla captured over the next month would become central to her case. On 14 separate occasions, the device picked up sounds in their bedroom that neither Layla nor Ahmed heard while sleeping. A woman's voice, speaking in a dialect of Arabic neither of them recognized. Sometimes it whispered what sounded like endearments. Other times it hissed threats. On one particularly disturbing recording from March 23, 2018, a voice clearly says, "He is not yours. You are mine. I was here first." Sheikh Hassan analyzed the recordings with 2 other scholars. All 3 confirmed that the voice patterns and linguistic structures were consistent with Jinn communication. More specifically, the possessive, intimate nature of the words pointed unmistakably to a Sila attachment. But understanding what was happening did not make stopping it easier. Sheikh Hassan performed Ruqya sessions, reciting specific verses from the Quran, meant to drive away malevolent entities. He prepared blessed water and oil for Layla to use in protection rituals. He taught her verses to recite and prayers to maintain. For brief periods, the attacks would cease. Then they would return with renewed intensity. The Sila seemed to learn, to adapt. After one particularly powerful Ruqya session in late April, Layla experienced 2 weeks of peace. Then the entity returned, but its approach had changed. Instead of violent attacks, it began appearing during Layla's waking hours, visible to her in reflections and peripheral vision. The psychological toll became as devastating as the physical attacks had been. This adaptability, this intimate knowledge of its victim, reflects a deeper truth about certain types of Jinn. They are not mindless forces, but intelligent beings capable of observation, learning, and strategic thinking. The Sila studies its target, learns their routines, discovers their vulnerabilities. It knows when protective prayers are being neglected, when faith wavers, when fear creates openings. Yet the Sila, as disturbing as it is, represents an external threat, an entity that attaches from outside. Far more unsettling is the concept of the Qareen, an entity Islamic theology claims has been with each of us from the moment of our birth. Dr. Ibrahim Khalil, a scholar of Islamic eschatology at Al-Azhar University, explains the Qareen as a companion Jinn assigned to every human being. Unlike the Sila or other Jinn that may or may not cross our paths, the Qareen is constant, inseparable, closer to us than our own shadows. Its purpose, according to Islamic tradition, is to lead humans astray through whispered suggestions, negative thoughts, and temptations toward sin. The Prophet Muhammad himself spoke of the Qareen, acknowledging that even he had one, though he claimed that through God's help, his Qareen had submitted to Islam and only suggested good. For the rest of humanity, the Qareen remains an invisible adversary engaged in lifelong psychological warfare. Dr. Khalil describes the Qareen's knowledge as disturbingly intimate. It knows your thoughts because it has observed you your entire life. It knows your weaknesses because it has been there for every moment of doubt, every temptation, every secret shame. It knows what arguments work on you, what fears paralyze you, what desires control you. Imagine an enemy who has studied you since infancy, who knows every psychological vulnerability, and whose sole purpose is to exploit that knowledge to lead you toward destruction. The Qareen differs from external Jinn attachments in its permanence. You cannot exercise your Qareen because it is not an invader, but an assigned companion. Traditional protection methods that might drive away a Sila or other malevolent Jinn have no effect on the Qareen. Instead, Islamic theology teaches constant vigilance, recognizing which thoughts originate from your own consciousness and which are whispered suggestions from your invisible companion. This creates a disturbing theological question. How much of what we consider our own thoughts actually originates within us? When you feel a sudden urge toward anger, jealousy, or despair, Is that your genuine emotion or the Qareen's whispered suggestion? Islamic scholars teach that the Qareen works subtly, making its suggestions feel like natural thoughts arising from your own mind. For Layla, learning about the Qareen added another layer to her torment. Sheikh Hassan explained that while the Sila was the primary threat, her Qareen would be working in parallel, amplifying her fear, suggesting that protection was useless, whispering that she should give up. The external demon and the internal one working in concert, each magnifying the other's effect. Traditional protection methods against Jinn, like the Sila, involve Quranic recitation, blessed objects, specific prayers, and maintaining ritual purity. These methods work, when they work, by creating spiritual barriers that Jinn cannot easily cross. But they require consistent application and genuine faith. This is where many protections fail, not because the methods are ineffective, but because humans are inconsistent. We forget to recite our protective verses. We skip our prayers. Our faith wavers under sustained assault, and the entities know this. They wait. They probe for weaknesses in our spiritual defenses the way a burglar tests doors and windows. The Qareen whispers that you are too tired for prayers tonight, that one night will not matter, that maybe all this protection is superstition anyway. When the defenses drop, the Sila strikes. By June of 2018, Layla was sleeping barely 3 hours per night, terrified of what would happen when she closed her eyes. The scratches and marks continued appearing. Her marriage was straining under the pressure. Ahmed believed her, supported her, but the constant tension was corrosive. How do you build a normal life when an invisible entity claims ownership of your wife? Sheikh Hassan and his colleagues tried more intensive interventions. They performed ruqya in Layla's home, anointing every doorway and window. They taught Ahmed protective prayers to recite over his wife while she slept. They created a regimen of spiritual practice meant to strengthen Layla's defenses. The attacks diminished but never fully stopped. As of the last entry in Layla's journal, dated October of 2019, she was still experiencing periodic encounters, though less frequent and less violent than before. The Sila had not been banished, merely held at bay through constant vigilance and spiritual warfare. Her case remains documented, studied by researchers trying to understand the phenomenon of Jinn attachment. The recordings exist. The medical records exist. The photographs of unexplained injuries exist. What they mean, what they prove, remains a matter of interpretation. But for those who accept the reality of these entities, cases like Layla's offer a glimpse into forms of intimate horror that bypass all our conventional defenses. Locks mean nothing to beings that are not physical. Distance offers no protection from something that can cross space instantly. And how do you fight an enemy you cannot see, that knows you more intimately than you know yourself, that may have been assigned to you before you took your first breath? No. In the rocky highlands of southern Jordan, where the sandstone cliffs bleed rust red into the desert sky, there exists a wilderness that has resisted human dominion for millennia. The nature reserves scattered throughout this ancient landscape attract adventurers from across the globe, drawn by the promise of untouched beauty and the kind of solitude that has become rare in our crowded world. But among the park rangers who maintain these protected lands, there circulates a different kind of knowledge, passed down through decades of service, whispered during shift changes, never recorded in official reports. They have learned that certain areas demand respect for reasons that have nothing to do with terrain, difficulty, or weather conditions. The encounters began to form a pattern in the late 1990s, though the rangers insist similar incidents stretch back much further, lost in the years before anyone thought to compare notes systematically. Hikers would return from multi-day treks with stories that matched too closely to be coincidental. They described seeing a figure in the distance, always at dusk or dawn, positioned on ridgelines or near isolated water sources. From afar, the shape appeared human enough, a fellow traveler perhaps, someone else drawn to these remote places. But those who observed for more than a fleeting moment reported movements that defied natural explanation. A German couple in 2003 watched what they assumed was another hiker descend a cliff face near Wadi Rumdi. They called out, concerned for the person's safety on such a dangerous approach. The figure paused, seemed to regard them from perhaps 200 meters away, then continued downward at the same steady pace, moving across rock that offered no handholds, no ledges, nothing that could support human weight. When they hiked to the base of the cliff to offer assistance, they found no one. No footprints in the sand. No equipment. No trace that anyone had been there at all. 3 months later, a Jordanian university group camping in the Dana Biosphere Reserve reported nearly identical details. One of their members had risen before dawn to photograph the sunrise and saw a human silhouette standing on an outcropping above their camp. She waved, assuming it was one of her companions, but received no response. The figure stood motionless for several minutes, then moved laterally across the rock face in a way she described as sliding rather than walking. She ran back to wake the others, but when they emerged from their tents, the ridge stood empty against the brightening sky. The park rangers have developed their own taxonomy for these reports. There are the sightings, the most common category, where hikers glimpse the figure briefly before it disappears. There are the paralleling incidents, where the presence keeps pace with travelers for extended periods, always maintaining distance, never approaching directly. And then there are the territorial encounters, rarer and more unsettling, where hikers report an overwhelming compulsion to leave an area, a sensation of being watched by something hostile, a certainty that they are not welcome. Hassan al-Rashid worked as a senior ranger in the Dana Reserve for 28 years before his retirement in 2015. He agreed to speak about the unofficial protocols only after being assured his account would not be attributed in any official capacity. He explained that rangers learn quickly which areas generate reports most frequently. There is a particular canyon in the western section of the reserve where 3 separate groups reported identical experiences over a span of just 14 months. Each described settling down for an evening meal after a day of hiking, then hearing footsteps circling their campsite just beyond the reach of their firelight. When they called out or shone flashlights toward the sound, the footsteps would stop. When they returned to their meal, the circling would resume. According to Hassan, the rangers began advising hikers to avoid camping in that canyon, citing rockfall danger or flash flood risk, anything but the real reason. They couldn't officially acknowledge that something in those rocks seemed to object to human presence after dark. They couldn't file reports that would brand them as superstitious or unstable. So they developed polite fictions, gentle redirections, suggestions that moved visitors towards safer areas without ever explaining what made certain locations unsafe. The patterns became clearer when a graduate student studying seasonal wildlife movements accidentally created a database of ranger incident reports. She had been granted access to decades of documentation and noticed recurring phrases in the notes. References to hikers requesting early extraction due to feeling uncomfortable. Multiple mentions of equipment failures in specific grid coordinates. Unusual numbers of people reporting disorientation or losing the trail in areas where the paths were clearly marked. When she mapped these incidents geographically and chronologically, something remarkable emerged. The encounters clustered in the late spring and early autumn, with almost no reports during summer or winter. They concentrated around water sources and natural shelters, the kinds of places that would have been vital to survival in earlier eras. The figure appeared most frequently during transitional times of day, those liminal moments when light shifts and shadows lengthen, and the world seems suspended between states. This seasonal pattern echoes something much older than modern park ranger protocols. The Jann, the most ancient classification of Jinn in Islamic and pre-Islamic tradition, were understood to be creatures of the wilderness, less intelligent than their more evolved cousins, but more fundamentally connected to the natural world. They appear in the earliest Arabic poetry, in verses composed centuries before Islam, described as the spirits inhabiting remote places, territorial and unpredictable, neither wholly malevolent nor entirely indifferent to human presence. The pre-Islamic poets called them the first people, existing in the world before humanity spread across the earth. They were said to live in the empty places, the deserts and mountains and canyons, where human civilization had not yet imposed its order. Unlike the more sophisticated types of Jinn that developed elaborate societies mirroring human culture, the Jann remained wild, governed by instinct and territorial imperative rather than complex social structures. In this ancient understanding, the Jann were not evil, but they were dangerous in the way that wild animals are dangerous. They might ignore human presence, or they might react with hostility, depending on factors that humans could not predict or control. They were thought to be particularly active during seasonal transitions, when the natural world itself was in flux, when the boundaries between different states of being grew thin and permeable. The hikers who encountered the figure in Jordan's nature reserves often struggled to articulate what disturbed them most about the experience. It wasn't simply that the figure moved strangely or disappeared without explanation. It was something about the quality of its presence, the sense that they were being evaluated by an intelligence that operated according to completely foreign criteria. Several reported feeling that they had intruded on something private, that they had stumbled into a space where they fundamentally did not belong. A British photographer who spent 2 weeks in the Wadi Mujib Reserve in 28 described an encounter that captures this quality perfectly. He had hiked deep into a narrow canyon, searching for a specific angle on the layered rock formations. As he set up his camera, he became aware of a figure standing on a ledge perhaps 50 meters upstream. He called out a greeting in English, then in his limited Arabic. The figure did not respond, but did not leave. He returned to his photography, assuming it was a local shepherd or another photographer. For the next hour, every time he looked up, the figure remained in exactly the same position. Not shifting weight, not sitting down to rest, not doing anything that a living person does when standing still for extended periods. Just standing, seemingly watching. The photographer began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. The sun was beginning to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and crimson. He packed his equipment and started back toward the main trail. When he glanced back one final time, the ledge was empty. But he couldn't shake the conviction that he was still being watched, that something was following his progress out of the canyon, ensuring that he left. The rangers acknowledged these experiences with a kind of resigned acceptance. They have their own encounters, their own moments when the wilderness reveals itself as something other than mere landscape. They speak of finding campsites abandoned in haste, with gear left behind, as if the occupants fled in panic. They describe the peculiar silence that sometimes descends on certain areas, the way the normal sounds of wildlife suddenly cease, leaving a void that feels almost physical in its intensity. What makes the Jann different from other types of Jinn, according to the traditional sources, is this very unpredictability. The more sophisticated Jinn can be bargained with, understood according to their own complex social rules. But the Jann remain fundamentally wild, creatures of pure instinct and territorial impulse. They do not negotiate. They do not explain themselves. They simply are, occupying spaces that humans have temporarily borrowed, but will never truly own. The seasonal patterns observed in Jordan mirror reports from other wilderness areas, where the boundary between human civilization and untamed nature remains distinct. Similar encounters cluster around transitional times, both in terms of season and time of day. They occur in places that still retain some quality of genuine wilderness, areas that have not been entirely domesticated by human presence. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we displace when we expand into wild spaces, what intelligences or presences we assume do not exist simply because they do not fit our understanding of what is possible. The rangers who have worked these lands for decades have reached an accommodation with the unknown. They cannot explain it, cannot report it officially, cannot reduce it to the kind of rational framework that modern institutions demand. But they respect it. They learn which areas to avoid during certain seasons, which canyons seem to tolerate human presence and which do not. The Jann, if we accept the testimony of centuries and the careful observations of those who work in the wild places, represent something primal in our relationship with the natural world. They embody the reality that some spaces do not belong to us, that our maps and trails and official designations are a thin veneer over something much older and much stranger. They remind us that wilderness is not simply the absence of civilization, but a presence in its own right, one that may or may not welcome our intrusion, one that operates according to laws we have forgotten or never knew. In the winter of 2007, in a middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Riyadh, the Al-Mansour family began to notice that something in their home had fundamentally changed. It started small, as these things often do. A whisper in the hallway when no one was there, the faint smell of sulfur drifting through rooms with no apparent source. Objects that shifted position between one moment and the next. But within 3 weeks, what had begun as unsettling quirks had escalated into a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare that would be documented by religious scholars, investigators, and eventually Saudi authorities over the course of 18 months. This was not a haunting. This was an occupation. The family consisted of 7 people. Ahmed al-Mansour, a civil engineer in his early 40s. His wife Fatima, a school teacher. Their 4 children ranging from 8 to 17 years old. And Ahmed's elderly mother who had moved in with them after his father passed away. They were, by all accounts, an ordinary family. Devout but not extreme in their practice. Well-liked in their community. There was nothing in their background that suggested they would become the subjects of one of the most thoroughly documented cases of Jinn infestation in modern Saudi Arabian history. The entity that entered their lives would come to be identified by multiple Islamic scholars as a Shaytan, a specific and deeply malevolent category of Jinn. To understand what made this case so extraordinary and so deeply troubling, you must first understand what separates a Shaytan from other Jinn. According to Islamic theology, all Jinn are created beings made from smokeless fire, existing in a dimension parallel to our own. Like humans, they possess free will. They can choose good or evil. They can be righteous or corrupt. Most Jinn, even those who occasionally interact negatively with humans, are not inherently evil. They are simply beings pursuing their own interests in a world they share with us. But the Shaytan are different. These are Jinn who have made a conscious, irrevocable choice to align themselves with Iblis, the original rebel against divine command. They have dedicated their existence not simply to chaos or mischief, but to a specific theological mission: the corruption and destruction of human souls. This is not behavior driven by hunger or territoriality, or even malice in the conventional sense. It is ideological. It is strategic. It is patient. And according to the scholars who eventually studied the Al-Mansur case, this particular Shaytan displayed a level of intelligence and methodical planning that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The first phase of the infestation lasted roughly 6 weeks. During this time, the entity appeared to be studying the family. Ahmed would later describe the sensation of being watched in every room of the house, even in moments of complete solitude. His 17-year-old daughter, Layla, reported waking in the night to see a shadow standing in the corner of her bedroom, humanoid in shape but wrong in its proportions, with limbs that were too long and a head that tilted at an unnatural angle. When she would turn on the light, nothing was there. But the moment darkness returned, so did the presence. The youngest child, 8-year-old Omar, began having conversations with what he called his new friend. His parents initially dismissed this as an imaginary companion, not uncommon for children his age. But Omar described his friend in disturbing detail. The friend had eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The friend knew things about the family that Omar could not possibly know himself. Intimate details about his parents' private conversations, about his grandmother's health problems that had been carefully kept from the children. The friend told Omar secrets about his siblings, true secrets, things they had done and never confessed. When Ahmed and Fatima finally pressed their son about where he spoke to this friend, Omar led them to the basement storage room. The space was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, despite Riyadh's winter warmth. And there, on the concrete floor, they found marks. Not random scratches, but symbols. Geometric patterns that none of them recognized, drawn in what appeared to be ash or fine black powder. Ahmed photographed these marks. He collected samples of the powder, which would later be analyzed and found to contain no identifiable conventional materials. These photographs still exist in the documentation compiled by the Islamic scholars who investigated the case. Phase 2 began when the entity stopped observing and started acting. The family would come home to find every piece of furniture in the living room, stacked in an impossible tower, reaching to the ceiling, balanced in ways that defied basic physics. Cabinet doors throughout the house would open and close in sequence, one after another, creating a cascading rhythm that echoed through the halls. The temperature in individual rooms would swing wildly, plunging to near freezing or spiking to unbearable heat within seconds. But these physical manifestations, disturbing as they were, proved to be merely the opening moves in a much more sinister game. The entity began to exploit individual weaknesses. Ahmed's mother suffered from heart problems. She began reporting that something was sitting on her chest at night, compressing her lungs until she could barely breathe. On 3 separate occasions, she was rushed to the hospital, convinced she was experiencing cardiac arrest. Medical tests found nothing wrong with her heart. But the pressure returned, night after night, only in that house, only in her bedroom. Layla, the oldest daughter, had struggled with anxiety and self-image issues common to teenage girls. The entity weaponized this. She began hearing a voice, always when she was alone, whispering cruelties about her appearance, her worth, her future. But the voice knew things. It would reference private journal entries she had written. It would repeat verbatim things she had said, only to her closest friends. The psychological precision was devastating. Within 2 months, Layla had lost nearly 20 pounds and required psychiatric intervention for severe depression. The 14-year-old son, Khalid, had a secret. He had been stealing small amounts of money from his parents and lying about where it went. No one in the family knew, but the entity knew. It began leaving notes for him, written in Arabic script on scraps of paper that would appear in his school bag, in his pockets, tucked into his Quran. The notes detailed exactly how much he had stolen and threatened to reveal his crimes. Khalid's guilt and fear became so overwhelming that he eventually confessed everything to his parents, sobbing that the devil himself knew his sins. By month 4, the family had sought help from their local imam. He came to the house, performed prayers, recited protective verses from the Quran. For 3 days, the activity stopped completely. The family dared to hope that their ordeal had ended. But on the 4th night, the entity returned with renewed intensity, and this time, it brought proof that it had been listening to everything the imam had said. During his visit, the imam had privately counseled Ahmed about maintaining patience and faith, referencing a specific verse from Surah al-Baqarah. That night, the words of that verse appeared burned into the wall of Ahmed's bedroom, scorched into the paint in perfect Arabic calligraphy. But the words were inverted, written backward, a mockery of the sacred text. The imam returned, saw what had been done, and refused to enter the house again. He told Ahmed that what resided there was beyond his ability to confront. The family contacted a more experienced practitioner, a respected scholar known for successfully performing ruqyah, Islamic exorcism. He agreed to help and spent an entire night in the house, reciting Quranic verses and commanding the entity to depart. What happened during that night was documented in his own written testimony, submitted later to religious authorities. He described an intelligence that responded to his recitations that seemed to anticipate which verses he would use and countered them. He heard laughter coming from empty rooms. He saw doors slam with enough force to crack their frames. And at one point, he reported, he heard his own voice speaking from the darkness, repeating his words back to him with perfect accuracy, but filled with contempt. Most disturbing was what happened when he directly commanded the entity to identify itself. The temperature in the room dropped so severely that his breath became visible mist, and a voice responded. Not a whisper or a groan, but a clear, articulate voice speaking classical Arabic with perfect grammar and pronunciation. The voice stated that it had every right to be in this house, that it had been invited, though it refused to explain how or by whom. It declared that its purpose was to break this family, to demonstrate the weakness of their faith, to prove that humans could be turned against their creator through sufficient pressure and fear. The exorcist continued his recitations throughout the night, but by dawn, he told the family he could not help them. The entity was too strong, too intelligent, too deeply rooted in the location. He was the first to use the word Shaytan, explaining that this was no ordinary Jinn, but one who had chosen absolute rebellion, one who possessed knowledge and capabilities that suggested significant spiritual rank in the hierarchy of evil. He recommended they abandon the house. He himself left, and according to his testimony, refused payment for his services, stating he had failed in his duty. A second exorcist lasted only 2 hours. A third refused to even enter after standing on the threshold and claiming he could feel the malevolence radiating from within like heat from a furnace. This was unprecedented. These were not superstitious villagers or untrained volunteers. These were scholars with decades of experience in dealing with Jinn infestations, possessions, and spiritual disturbances. Their refusal to continue spoke to something genuinely exceptional about what inhabited the Al-Mansur home. By month 9, the situation had deteriorated beyond the psychological. Family members began experiencing physical attacks. Scratches would appear on their skin, 3 parallel marks that seemed to be a signature of the entity. Objects would be thrown with enough force to injure. Ahmed was struck in the head by a heavy book that flew across the room while the family was gathered for dinner. The impact required 7 stitches. Video footage from that incident exists. The camera was set up by investigators documenting the case, and the recording clearly shows the book lifting from a shelf and hurtling through the air with no visible cause. The entity began to manifest more overtly. Multiple family members and outside witnesses reported seeing a figure in the house. Descriptions varied slightly but shared common elements. Tall, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs and fingers. Features that were almost human but distorted, as if someone had stretched a human form like clay. Eyes that reflected light with a reddish gleam. Most witnesses could only glimpse it peripherally before it would vanish, but the consistency of the descriptions across multiple independent observers became part of the documented evidence. What makes the Al-Mansur case particularly significant in the study of Shaytan phenomena is the level of documentation. This was not folklore or second-hand testimony. Religious authorities, researchers, and even skeptical journalists visited the home. They witnessed events firsthand. They collected physical evidence. They recorded video and audio. The Saudi government eventually became involved, not because they wanted publicity, but because the case had become impossible to ignore. The theological implications troubled Islamic scholars deeply. The Shaytan demonstrated not just malevolence, but purpose. It was attempting to break the family's faith specifically. It targeted their religious practice, their prayers, their trust in divine protection. When Fatima would recite protective verses, the entity would mock her by repeating them in twisted form. When the family gathered for prayer, objects would be hurled at them, disrupting their worship. This was not random chaos. This was an assault on their spirituality itself, exactly what theological texts describe as the primary function of Shaytan, to sever the connection between humans and their creator. By month 18, the family made the decision the first exorcist had recommended. They abandoned the house. Ahmed sold it at a devastating financial loss, disclosing to the buyer what had occurred, as his faith required honesty despite the consequences. The new owner, a skeptic, dismissed the stories as superstition. He lasted 6 weeks before he too fled, reporting experiences that mirrored what the Al-Mansur family had endured. The house stands empty now. Local residents avoid the street. The case remains in the files of Saudi religious authorities as one of the most compelling documented examples of Shaytan infestation. The video evidence, the written testimonies, the physical samples, all exist as proof of something that challenges materialist explanations. What happened to the Al-Mansur family raises questions that extend beyond this single case. If a Shaytan can be this patient, this intelligent, this strategically focused in tormenting one family, what does that suggest about the broader spiritual war that Islamic theology describes? These are not mindless monsters. They are calculating adversaries with supernatural abilities and ideological commitment to human destruction. They choose this path. That choice, that conscious dedication to evil, makes them more dangerous than any natural predator or random, malevolent force. The family has recovered, though none of them will discuss the details publicly. They moved to another city. They rebuilt their lives. But Ahmed stated, in his final interview with investigators, that the experience changed his understanding of reality fundamentally. Evil, he said, is not an abstract concept or a metaphor for human weakness. It is real. It is intelligent. And it is patient enough to invest years in destroying a single family, simply to prove that it can. Throughout the months of research, interviews with scholars, and the examination of ancient texts, a pattern began to emerge. Something was missing from the classification of Jinn, something nobody wanted to talk about. The 6 types of Djinn are well documented. Scholars discuss them openly. Books describe them in detail. But during this investigation, another category kept appearing in fragments, in whispers, in the uncomfortable silences that followed certain questions. Multiple sources, across different countries and traditions, made reference to a 7th type, a category that is rarely named and never fully described. The first hints came from marginal notes in medieval manuscript. Brief passages, often scratched out or damaged, that mention Jinn existing between states. Not of fire or air or earth, but something that defies the natural order. These entities were described not as inhabitants of reality, but as beings capable of influencing reality itself, changing the fundamental nature of what is possible. Professor Rashid Al-Mansour, a specialist in Islamic mysticism and Jinn folklore, agreed to an interview about the 6 traditional categories. When asked about references to a 7th type, his demeanor changed completely. He removed his microphone, asked that the cameras be turned off, and politely but firmly ended the session. He would only say, off the record, that some doors should remain closed. Dr. Amira Khalil, another scholar who has spent decades researching these entities, had a similar reaction. She was willing to discuss every other aspect of Jinn classification, but when presented with historical references to this unnamed category, she became visibly uncomfortable. She refused to continue that line of discussion on camera. Later, she would only offer this cryptic statement: even other Jinn fear what exists beyond the traditional 6. The question becomes unavoidable. Why would information about one type be suppressed or lost when the others are openly discussed in religious texts, folklore, and academic literature? What could be so dangerous that even speaking about it directly is avoided by those who specialize in these matters? Perhaps some things remain hidden not because we have forgotten them, but because something wants us to forget. And perhaps the most terrifying category of all is the one that remains unknown. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.